For the first time in over a decade, NOAA is telling the country to relax. The 2026 Atlantic hurricane season officially opens June 1. When NOAA released its forecast 3 days ago, the headline read, like something Gulf Coast residents had been waiting years to hear, below normal season. 8 to 14 named storms. A 55% chance it stays quiet. The press ran with it. Social media ran with it. Insurance agents fielded fewer calls. And somewhere in the middle of that forecast, in a paragraph most people never reached, NOAA's lead seasonal hurricane forecaster Matthew Rosencrans said something that changes everything about how Florida should read those numbers. He said homegrown Gulf storms could still spin up. When they do, he said, they come with short awareness times. Is a below-normal 2026 hurricane season the safest window Florida has had in a decade, or the exact setup that produced Idalia? Start with the number, because the number is real. NOAA gave 2026 a 55% chance of a below-normal season. The primary driver is El Niño, expected to develop and strengthen through summer and into peak season. El Niño increases upper-level wind shear across the Atlantic basin, which tears developing tropical systems apart before they can organize. Colorado State University's team reached nearly the same conclusion in April. 13 named storms, 6 hurricanes, 2 major storms, both pointing at the same mechanism, both pointing at the Atlantic. The important word in that forecast is Atlantic. El Niño suppresses long-track storms that develop in the open ocean east of the Caribbean and spend weeks crossing the basin before they approach land. The model is designed for that kind of storm. The track is visible for days. The warnings come in sequence. El Niño came to suppress the Atlantic. Nobody told the Gulf. The Gulf of Mexico sits at the edge of El Niño's suppression zone. Its water temperatures are fed by a separate circulation system that El Niño does not directly control. Heading into the 2026 season, Gulf SST's sea surface temperatures have been running above the long-term average in the northern basin. That warm water has been accumulating since March. It won't dissipate quickly, and the storms that tap into it don't have weeks of open ocean ahead of them before reaching Florida. They organize in the Gulf. They arrive from the Gulf. Is a below-normal 2026 hurricane season the safest window Florida has had in a decade? Or the exact setup that produced Idalia? On August 27, 2023, Hurricane Idalia made landfall near Keaton Beach in Florida's Big Bend region as a Category 3 hurricane, maximum sustained winds 125 miles per hour. 72 hours before that landfall, it was a tropical storm in the southeastern Gulf. Idalia intensified from tropical storm to Category 3 in roughly 48 hours. The NHC classified it as a rapidly intensifying storm. It crossed water in the northeastern Gulf running 1 to 2 degrees Celsius above normal, warm enough to act as additional fuel while the eye wall was still organizing. It hit a stretch of Gulf coastline that hadn't taken a direct major hurricane strike since the 1950s. The storm surge reached 12 to 16 feet in some areas. Parts of Steinhatchee lost entire blocks. This is the storm Rosencrans was describing. He didn't name it. He didn't need to. Anyone on Florida's Gulf Coast knew exactly what he meant. The 2023 season didn't feel catastrophic until it was. No storm reached the death toll or damage figure of Ian in 2022. By mid-August, the season had felt manageable, models active but nothing organized into a serious Florida threat. Then Idalia formed in the Gulf. There is a specific vulnerability in how the public follows hurricane season. The NHC tropical weather outlooks, the model runs, the advisory cycles, they are structured around long-track Atlantic development. A disturbance off the African coast gets flagged. A system in the central Atlantic earns an area of interest designation. The language implies lead time. The viewer internalizes that they will have days to watch something approach. Homegrown Gulf storms operate on a different timeline. A storm organizing in the central Gulf on a Monday can be on the coast by Thursday. 48 of those hours may pass before the system reaches hurricane strength. On August 13, 2004, Hurricane Charley made landfall at Punta Gorda, Florida, as a Category 4 storm. Maximum sustained winds 150 miles per hour. Charley had intensified from Category 2 to Category 4 in the 4 hours before landfall. The NHC track had placed the storm's center roughly 20 miles east of where it arrived. 20 miles. At the scale of a hurricane's wind field, that is the difference between the house that lost its roof and the house that came down. Punta Gorda had not been in the forecast's most dangerous zone. Charlotte County residents who prepared based on the track's eastern bias found the Category 4 on their doorstep because the track shift, within the normal uncertainty range of any NHC forecast, moved the worst of it onto them. A Gulf storm compresses the timeline before that error can be corrected. Every hour of lead time lost is an hour of preparation that cannot be recovered. The NHC issues the best forecast its tools can produce. The tools have uncertainty built into them. In a Gulf storm, that uncertainty resolves closer to landfall than the evacuation math can accommodate. Weakening is not retreating. 4 words. Gulf Coast residents have heard the first word weakening as reassurance before every storm that didn't fully cooperate with the model. Charley was weakening on its way to Punta Gorda. It weakened from Category 4 to Category 4. Idalia's intensity forecast carried uncertainty through its final 24 hours. Michael intensified to Category 5 in the hours before Mexico Beach. The storm that arrives is the storm that counts, not the storm that the 11 p.m. advisory described. NOAA gave 2026 a 55% chance of below normal activity. That sounds like a forecast for a quiet year. It is a forecast for a quiet Atlantic basin. The distinction matters more than it sounds. A below normal probability says nothing about which storms form, where they form, or what they do when they get there. The ACE index. Accumulated cyclone energy, the metric NHC uses to measure total seasonal storm activity, could finish well below average, and a single Cat 3 could still make landfall in Pinellas County. The Saffir-Simpson scale measures wind speed only, not storm surge. A storm making landfall at Category 2 with an unusual approach angle can push a surge that a Category 3 from a more common track would not. The category tells you about the wind. The surge comes from the geometry of the coastline, the angle of approach, and the forward speed, none of which are in the seasonal outlook. NOAA's Rosencrans used the phrase short awareness times, specifically in reference to Gulf homegrown systems. He was describing a timeline with a standard warning and preparation sequence, watch, warning, evacuation order, departure, may compress to the point where the later steps overlap. Is a below normal 2026 hurricane season the safest window Florida has had in a decade, or the exact setup that produced Idalia? El Niño suppresses Atlantic storms by increasing wind shear aloft. It does not cool the Gulf. Sea surface temperatures in the northern Gulf heading into June 2026 have been running above the long-term average. The Gulf circulates heat differently from the open Atlantic. It is a semi-enclosed basin, and water warmed through spring does not rapidly dissipate. A storm system entering the Gulf in August or September finds water that has been accumulating heat for months. Rapid intensification. The formal NHC threshold for a storm's maximum sustained winds increasing by 35 or more miles per hour in 24 hours requires warm, deep water below the storm's core. The Gulf has supplied that water to the storms that have crossed it in recent seasons. Idalia found it in 2023. Michael found it in 2018 before arriving at Mexico Beach as a Category 5. The NHC cannot forecast rapid intensification with high accuracy beyond 12 to 24 hours. That is not a failure of the models. It reflects how dependent RI is on the exact position of the storm, the exact depth of warm water it crosses, and the atmospheric conditions aloft at a given moment. Those inputs converge in a window too narrow for current operational models to fully resolve. What this produces in practice: a Gulf storm can cross the RI threshold in a window that falls between two NHC advisory cycles. The advisory at 11 p.m. says it is strengthening. The one at 5 a.m. says it is a hurricane. The landfall is at 10 a.m. Weakening is not retreating. The corollary is the one nobody reads past. A storm that looks like it peaked also looks like it stalled. The window between a forecast showing weakening and a landfall showing Category 4 is exactly where the evacuation mathematics break down. Not because the forecast has failed, but because the storm resolved its intensity inside the error bars of the best forecast available. Colorado State University's April 2026 forecast used a statistical analog approach, years with similar late spring El Niño development trajectories, to estimate what kind of season the Atlantic is likely to produce. Their result: 13 named storms, 6 hurricanes, 2 major hurricanes, 2 major hurricanes, below the 1991-21 average. Consistent with NOAA. CSU's forecasters also noted that when El Niño's timing is uncertain, specifically whether it will be fully entrenched by August or still developing, its suppressive effect on peak season activity is less reliable. The 2026 forecast carries that uncertainty. NOAA acknowledged it directly. There is still uncertainty in how each season will unfold. That sentence appeared in the prepared remarks alongside the below normal headline. Most coverage led with the headline. What the CSU and NOAA forecasts share, they are basin-wide, season-long probability estimates built for what they measure. They were not designed to tell a resident of Naples or Pensacola whether a storm will form in the Gulf in August and reach their county in September. That answer lives outside the seasonal forecast. The National Hurricane Center and the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council have both published materials on a specific scenario, a major hurricane making a direct track toward Tampa Bay from the southwest. Tampa Bay is a funnel. It narrows as it reaches the city, concentrating storm surge in a way that makes the Tampa metro one of the most surge-vulnerable major population centers in the country. NOAA and USGS models show a direct major hurricane strike could produce 30 to 40 feet of storm surge in the most exposed areas. 3 million people live in the immediate metro. Tampa Bay has not taken a direct major hurricane hit in recorded history. The last serious storm to make significant impact was in 1921, before most of the current development existed. The city that faces that storm today would not resemble anything from 1921. A Gulf homegrown system is among the scenarios most capable of producing the Tampa Bay direct track. A storm developing in the Central Gulf has a shorter, more flexible approach than an Atlantic storm steered across the Caribbean for days. The Gulf's geometry allows approach angles that a long-track Atlantic system almost never achieves. Is a below-normal 2026 hurricane season the safest window Florida has had in a decade, or the exact setup that produced Idalia? In 2022, Hurricane Ian gave the Fort Myers area roughly 72 hours of escalating NHC forecasting before landfall. That window included watch issuance, warning issuance, mandatory evacuation orders, voluntary orders for broader areas, and 2 significant track shifts in the final 24 hours that moved the cone south, closer to Fort Myers, away from Tampa where preparations had been concentrated. 149 people died in Florida. NHC's post-storm analysis found storm surge was the primary cause of direct fatalities. Ian produced 18 feet of surge at Fort Myers Beach. A Gulf homegrown storm does not produce 72 hours of progressive warning as a guaranteed feature of its development. A disturbance flagged on a Tuesday morning NHC tropical weather outlook could be a tropical storm by Tuesday evening, a hurricane by Wednesday at the coast on Thursday. The watch warning evacuation sequence was not built around that compression. Emergency managers in Florida know this. The Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council has published reports specifically on the challenge of evacuation timing for Gulf-originating storms. The analysis is in the public record, updated after each season. The gap between what emergency managers have documented and what the public retains between seasons, that gap is where the homegrown Gulf storm finds its opening. NOAA's seasonal outlook is one of the most technically rigorous documents in American meteorology. The team uses global climate models, statistical analogs, sea surface temperature analysis, atmospheric circulation patterns, and upper-level wind data to produce probability ranges that, over the long run, verify well against observed seasonal activity. The forecast cannot tell you which storms will form. It cannot tell you where they will go. It cannot tell you what the Gulf will do with the heat it has held since March. NHC Director Ken Graham said this at the press conference in Lakeland. Although El Niño's impact in the Atlantic basin can often suppress hurricane development, there is still uncertainty in how each season will unfold. The phrase "still uncertainty" covers the El Niño timing question, the warm Atlantic water temperatures CSU noted, and the Gulf entirely, because the Gulf was never the thing El Niño came to suppress. The 5-day NHC track forecast has improved dramatically over the past 2 decades. The average track error at day 3 is roughly half of what it was in 2000. That improvement has saved lives by giving evacuations more reliable lead times. Intensity forecasting has not improved at the same rate. Predicting the onset and cessation of rapid intensification remains the hardest problem in operational hurricane forecasting. The NHC publishes its intensity forecast error statistics annually. At 24 hours, the median absolute intensity error runs around 10 to 12 knots. And for a storm in the early stages of RI, that error range can mean the difference between a Category 2 and a Category 4 at landfall. The physics involve interactions between the storm's inner core, the ocean layer below it, and the atmospheric environment above it, at spatial scales smaller than current operational models fully resolve. The problem is understood. The solution hasn't made it into the operational toolset yet. A Gulf storm in 2026 will be forecast with the best tools available. Those tools are better than they have ever been. They still carry an intensity uncertainty that is larger than the difference between staying and leaving. The Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council estimated that a direct major hurricane strike on Tampa Bay would require approximately 50 to 72 hours of lead time to complete a full evacuation of the highest risk zones. That estimate was built around the assumption that storm warnings arrive on the standard Atlantic track timeline. A Gulf homegrown storm compresses that window before the evacuation mathematics can be recalibrated. Florida's emergency managers have considered this. Hillsborough, Pinellas, Sarasota, and Lee counties have all published evacuation studies that acknowledge the Gulf origination problem. The challenge is that public preparedness campaigns are built around the average case, the long-track Atlantic storm that gives residents a week of escalating concern before they need to act. The average case is not the only case. And in a season where El Niño has suppressed everything except the Gulf, it may not be the most relevant case. The answer to that binary question will not come from the seasonal forecast. It will come from a sequence of signals the NHC publishes every day through November 30th. The first, sea surface temperatures in the northern Gulf, the loop current and its warm eddies. NOAA publishes daily SST analyses showing where the warmest water is concentrated. A warm eddy sitting north of the Yucatan Channel in August gives a Gulf homegrown storm the same fuel Idalia found in 2023. The second, the NHC 5-day tropical weather outlook for the Gulf specifically. When an area of interest appears in the Gulf, not the Atlantic, not the Caribbean, the timeline from that flag to potential landfall is shorter than most residents have internalized from watching Atlantic seasons. The third, the timing of El Niño's arrival. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center gives at least an 82% chance El Niño arrives by July. If it arrives late August or beyond, the suppression of peak season activity is reduced and the basin-wide numbers shift. None of these require a meteorology background to follow. The NHC Tropical Weather Outlook is published twice daily in plain language. The SST maps are public. The signal that most deserves attention is the Gulf on a quiet day in July when the Atlantic is calm and the news cycle has moved on. Every time NOAA releases a below-normal forecast following active seasons, a portion of the audience concludes the numbers were adjusted. The narrative varies, softened to prevent economic panic, influenced by insurance sector interests, or designed to limit evacuation costs. The 2026 forecast will attract that interpretation. NOAA's seasonal outlook methodology is published in peer-reviewed literature and built against 40-plus years of verified seasonal data. The primary driver, El Niño, is a measured, observable climate pattern whose influence on Atlantic hurricane activity has been documented since the 1980s. There is a physical mechanism attached: increased wind shear over the Atlantic, reducing the survival rate of developing tropical systems. HAARP's maximum operating power output is 3.6 megawatts. A mature Atlantic hurricane releases energy equivalent to 10,000 nuclear detonations per day. The scale difference makes the theory physically impossible. Not contested. Impossible. The 2026 forecast predicts below normal Atlantic activity because El Niño gives the Atlantic the shear it needs to disrupt storms. Rosencrans said this in the same press release. The mechanism does not extend to the Gulf at the same magnitude. After quiet hurricane seasons, the percentage of Gulf Coast residents who have completed basic preparedness tasks, evacuation plan documented, supplies assembled, insurance reviewed, declines. Researchers at Florida State University and the University of Miami have published on this. Insurance economists call it hazard amnesia. The 2024 season was active overall. Florida's Gulf Coast did not take a direct major hurricane hit. The 2025 season produced Hurricane Melissa in late October, which affected Jamaica and portions of Cuba before dissipating. No U.S. major landfall. 2 seasons since Ian. 2 seasons where the preparation habit was rehearsed but not required. A below-normal forecast reinforces the pattern. The headline says, quiet. The behavioral response says, safe. The Gulf says nothing. The category measures the wind. The surge doesn't care about the category. That sentence changes the picture for anyone who evaluated their 2026 risk by looking at a Saffir-Simpson number. The surge is what kills in Florida's coastal zones, in every significant Gulf landfall event in recorded history. It does not correlate neatly to category. It correlates to track, approach angle, storm size, and forward speed. None of those are in the seasonal outlook. None of them are in the number that ran in the headline. Return to the press conference in Lakeland. Ken Graham stood at the podium and said, "Don't let words like the low average change the way you prepare." That was in the prepared remarks. It wasn't improvised. NOAA included it because the agency understands the behavioral response to a below-normal headline and wrote the counter directly into the release. Rosencrans said short awareness times, specifically about Gulf homegrown systems. His exact words, "You could get those storms in the Gulf that have the short awareness times." That phrase, short awareness times, is technical, not alarmist. But for a Gulf Coast resident who has spent the last 2 seasons watching Atlantic systems and building their mental model of hurricane warning windows around what Atlantic systems provide, it describes a storm that operates outside that model entirely. The forecast is accurate for what it measures. It measures the basin. The Gulf Coast lives on the edge of the Gulf. And the Gulf in 2026, as far as the seasonal outlook is concerned, was never what El Niño was here to suppress. Is a below-normal 2026 hurricane season the safest window Florida has had in a decade, or the exact setup that produced Idalia? Those 2 things are not opposites. El Niño will likely suppress long-track Atlantic development. The seasonal numbers will probably finish somewhere in the below-average range NOAA and CSU have described. By the metrics the seasonal outlook measures, 2026 may be quieter than the last several years. And in the Gulf of Mexico, between June 1st and November 30, the conditions that allowed Idalia to go from tropical storm to Category 3 in 48 hours will still exist. The water is warm. El Niño's shear at those latitudes is weaker than over the open Atlantic. A storm forming in the central Gulf does not have weeks of open ocean before the coast. The next video in this series looks at the ACE index accumulated cyclone energy. In seasons where El Niño suppresses Atlantic activity while the Gulf stays warm, the ACE index can finish low overall, while 1 or 2 Gulf systems carry disproportionate energy and disproportionate landfall risk. What that distribution has looked like historically, and what it suggests about 2026, is a conversation worth having before August. On the road outside that coastal neighborhood, the evacuation sign points inland. It pointed the same direction in August 2023. Nobody was looking at it then either.